Andrew Martinez is the head archivist at the RISD Archives and the contributor and co-editor of Infinite Radius, founding Rhode Island School of Design, published in 2008. Andrew has written about the former RISD Museum director, Alexander Dorner, and the changes brought to the museum as well as the ideas he contributed to museum practice in general. Andrew came to RISD in 1997 to establish the RISD Archives and has published essays on the 1913 Armory Show that first brought modern art to the attention of the American public, as well as on histories of RISD. And his most recent work has focused on the former RISD Museum director, Alexander Dorner, and the changes he brought to the museum, as well as the ideas he contributed to museum practice in general. Please welcome Andrew Martinez.
First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me here. You know, it's always a great opportunity. When first asked to do this, I said I'm an archivist. What do I know about space, or how can I talk about it? But when you're given the opportunity to rethink what you do in terms of something new, it's always helpful. So I found in the end I had plenty I could add and say about this. So here I am, a live archivist. You can now say you've seen an archivist. But I will talk some about this. So my most recent work, I came off a sabbatical the latter half of last year. And I was working on a book, co-publishing it with and it has contributions from several of my colleagues here at RISD. If you know Sarah Gans-Blythe, the assistant director of the museum, Daniel Harkett, who has taught, and the Brown graduate actually has taught in history of art and visual culture. Those of you who know Professor Dietrich Neumann at Brown, history of architecture, he's contributed to the book as well. But basically, we have this book, Why Art Museums, which will be published in the fall through MIT Press, and it looks at the work of Alexander Dorner. Alexander Dorner was lived from 1893 to 1957, German native, grew up in Berlin. His father and grandfather were both theologians, and Dorner was interested in art history. That was his studies. Germanic field of art history probably tended to be more philosophical at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. Dorner came to America and RISD in 1938. He had come from the Landis Museum in Hanover, Germany, and when he first came there into the museum in 1923, he found the museum was pretty much divided up by collections by donor. So a collection that came from this so-and-so count or duke was kept together, segregated from another collection. It was a mix of copies, forgeries, antique relics, all sorts of things. And what he did was to undo the progression of the museum, break up these units that were more about memorials to donors than they were about telling a history, an art history. And through that, he developed his ideas about museum practice and aesthetics. Probably the most radical thing he did, and for what he is known for, was being in Hanover and in the Weimar Germany between the two world wars. It was a crossroads. He had an apartment in Berlin, and he was experiencing this mingling of artists from both the Soviet Union and from France, Spain, the Netherlands, Germany. They were all coming, working together, and he was also in close contact with many of the artists of the Bauhaus Academy. So this is a installation by the artist L. Lissitzky, a Soviet constructivist. And Lissitzky's work I'll show you an example momentarily, but Lissitzky was very much interested in many notions of art and display, and to go from working in 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions to creating an entire architectural art environment. This is called a prune room that Lissitzky exhibited. This is actually a 3-dimensional space. This is taking one of his 2-dimensional compositions and blowing it up to a 3rd dimension. You get a better idea here. This is a contemporary reconfiguration of one, a recreation of one. But Dorner, having seen these spaces by L. Lissitzky, was very much fascinated and wanted to think about how he could incorporate that kind of thinking into a museum. So he actually commissioned L. Lissitzky to make a room like this called the Abstract Cabinet for his Hanover Museum. This is from the International Art Journal Cahiers des Arts, which these articles came out in the 1930s, but this is Dorner writing about the museum and the ideas going on there in Hanover. So this is one view, and you'll see another view. And now I'm going to show you some close-ups here. So the idea here with what Lissitzky was doing was, one, to make the space interactive and no longer static, and taking into the account of the notion that Dorner would explore the idea that he would call art history a march of dimensions. So he saw Babylonian Egyptian art as being very frontal-oriented, 2-dimensional. The Greeks worked in the notion of the body in the sculpture, the 3-dimensional. Eventually, we get to the Renaissance where you have a fixed perspective, and the picture frame is very much like a window frame that you're looking through, off into the distance. And Dorner was intrigued, as were many contemporary artists, that with the changes in science and ideas like Einstein, modernism and the era of the 1920s and 30s, we were moving away from, we were moving to a more dynamic conception of space and time, and no longer living in a world of this idea of a single point perspective. So this was an interactive space. You'll see that these panels actually slide back and forth, so a viewer could actually experience, be involved in the space and move the artworks around. So these are the same pieces here. These have actually moved around. He didn't do things like install mirrors, so you could experience sculpture. This is a sculpture by Alexander Archipenko from back and behind in different views simultaneously. Perhaps the most radical part of this installation, and I'll demonstrate to you in a second, but this was L. Lissitzky's idea that these are all vertical metal grids going up and down the space. And on one side, you can think of it as this side is painted white, the side perpendicular to you as a viewer is gray, and this side will be black. So as you move through the space and your orientation changed, the wall itself changed. So this was an idea to bring this different idea of perception and movement through space into the gallery. There you have the case again. This case, actually, you could rotate it. So it was kind of on a conveyor belt where there were different objects laid out flat in there, and it would come around and show it to you differently. No problem. Okay. So here's some more views of the space itself, a modern recreation. And then what Dorner hoped to do but never accomplished was to then take the Hungarian artist Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who worked in many medias, including exhibit design. And this is a design that Dorner hoped to incorporate in his museum in Hanover, which was never executed, but since then has been recreated by several people using documentation. It was based on a show that was in Paris of decorative arts, and Moholy-Nagy had set up a German part of the exhibition, and here's how it looks recreated. But this was supposed to be the final room in Dorner's progression of galleries in Hanover, and this would be called the Room of Our Time. And moving away from painting, as you saw in the abstract cabinet, it would incorporate films, architectural diagrams, decorative objects, going into industrial design. And unfortunately, Dorner would leave Germany. Unfortunate for him, when the Nazis and Hitler came to power in 1933, much of what Dorner presented and the modern artists he championed would be considered degenerate. Of the degenerate art exhibition that the government circulated, over 240 works came from the Hanover, Germany Museum. So Dorner knew his museum practice was in danger. This is an installation of the show in Munich, the Degenerate Art Show that the government put on. And this is the Mondrian that you saw in the abstract cabinet. You can see Hanover listed here. But in a way, they're mocking this kind of geometric architectural display of the abstract cabinet by, you know, pointing out the craziness of this idea of installation. So Dorner fled Germany. He really didn't have a plan, but he did know some people in the US, one being the founder of the Bauhaus, Walter Gropius, the architect who in 1937 had come to Harvard to lead their architecture program, and he also knew Alfred Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art. Dorner's room had received such notoriety among the champions of modern art that a lot of people like Albert Barnes, the Barnes Collection in Philadelphia, Alfred Barr from MoMA, Philip Johnson, the architect, they all went to Hanover to see his space. So they knew Dorner and were familiar with him. So both Gropius and Alfred Barr were involved in helping Dorner find work. So when Dorner first arrived on the shores of America in 1937 on August, they put him to work helping them design and put together what would be the Bauhaus exhibition at MoMA in 1938. That's the exhibit as designed by Herbert Bayer. So Dorner's without work, but it just so happens that the director of the RISD Museum for many years, 1912 through 1937, Earl Rowe had passed away, and there was an opening, and Dorner was suggested to people at RISD in the search, and he was hired. So this is an article from Providence paper. We see that, we see that Dorner comes to the U.S. championed as a foe of Hitler. Unfortunately, that's December 37. When we get to September 1941, when Dorner is let go from the RISD Museum, these are not truthful, but he was labeled as a Nazi spy. So he had gone from full circle to being anti-Hitler to being in league with Hitler, which were just nasty rumors. He had an unhappy stay at the RISD Museum and was forced out, and if you want to know more, buy the book. So what Dorner was able to do, Dorner was described by one of his colleagues here at RISD as, Dr. Dorner is a master of propaganda and display. He has the instincts of the promoter, the imagination of the artist, and the ability of the showman to project his ideas in a dramatic and popular way. He is modern, progressive, and in the United States a leader in museum presentation. Dorner's belief, which he brought to RISD, was that an art museum, first and foremost, is an educational institution. The purpose of it is it should be as essential in modern life as the public schools or a college and university. So many of the things that Dorner brought to RISD when he came here was, one, he wanted more substantive publications from the RISD Museum. So when he would put on an exhibit, he actually had scholars writing exhibition catalogs for the first time for RISD. So Wolfgang Stechau was a Renaissance, Northern Renaissance specialist, another emigre from Nazi Germany teaching at the University of Wisconsin. Rhode Island Architecture was another major exhibit by a prominent architectural historian, Henry Russell Hitchcock. So Dorner he instituted what was the RISD Press, the Rhode Island Museum Press. And here's the kind of installations he was doing. This is the Rhode Island Architecture Exhibition. You can see it's a mixture of models, architectural elements, and large blown-up photographs. You know, different colorful displays, actually building new structures in the gallery to allow the exhibit to happen. By the way, all these images came back to RISD a few years ago. If you go into the picture collection on the second floor of the RISD library, you'll see these panels. We have all of them from his exhibit. Here you see Richard Neutra, German architect, relocated to America, did a home for John Nicholas Brown on Fisher's Island, and the model is there. So Dorner brought new exhibits, publications. He beefed up what was the museum bulletin to include scholarly articles, and he wanted these bulletins to also exist simultaneously as guides to the collection that would be housed in the gallery. So someone studying the Egyptian collection in the gallery could actually pick this up and read about the collection. Dorner eventually, not only for just children, but to all, he convinced the trustees to make admission free to the museum. Dorner started a museum education department with actual curators of education. And here you see these architect panels are actually have been repurposed into the children's gallery and used for teaching. Carolyn McDonald was the first curator of education at RISD. She helped put together what was a newsletter. They started clubs at the museum, and there was a newspaper club. And the kids involved in this, these were grade school kids, put out the newsletter and had these exercises that would lead kids through the galleries to experience the galleries. Dorner was quite a public figure, lecturing, giving his ideas on art. He started promotion within the RISD Museum. This is a mock-up of a poster he was having photographed and put together. These are store windows in downtown Providence. We're actually advertising of exhibitions with panels from the architecture exhibit. So Dorner's most radical thing that he did for the RISD Museum, in which he actually wanted to make museums relatable to the general public, was to tear down and reconfigure the galleries within the museum. He got through 5 in his time, and I'll show those to you. But what Dorner was trying to take on and deal with was his idea that the art history he had inherited as a practice and in the galleries in Hanover was more about aesthetics. And the philosophy of art and the way museums presented art was more about looking at eternal values of beauty and proportion, and what made good art and what didn't make good art, and that the works of art existed outside of time. And Dorner felt that was a dead end, that anyone coming to an art museum would actually be confused by what they saw, that the museum was no longer, could be considered a treasure house, and it had to be active and relatable. So the museum that preceded Dorner was first in the Waterman Building here at RISD. This was the first home of the RISD Museum in 1893. And much like the Chase Center here, this was the student entrance. If you think of the Gelman Gallery, where you have to walk around to the back, And this was the grand public entrance, so never would students and public intermingle. That's probably a good idea. When the museum opened, it was perfectly logical and reasonable to have plaster casts and copies of what were deemed famous works of art, and the notion of studying art was copying from the masters, studying the beauty of form and proportion. This is a Renaissance gallery at RISD, circa 1903. You can see it's crowded and stuffed to the gills with objects and paintings. This is the Japanese gallery linking up to Pendleton House. Another crowded display. More of the same salon-type installations. These are all up to about 1917. And this, if any of you know the Nature Lab at RISD, this is the same space. But these are Saturday school students copying fragments of textiles. And in the back here, you see these flip frames, but these are etchings and engravings of famous paintings and works of art. So that was perfectly reasonable for a museum and study collection. That's Earl Rowe, the director, in front of Pendleton House with students. And Pendleton House itself was a set of period rooms, creating how the rooms may have looked for colonial furniture from the 17th and 18th century. These are initial plans for the RISD Museum in 1920, how it wasn't built. That's Pendleton House there in the middle. And you see this grand two-story building with the large columns, huge museum house. What was built instead was this very subtle Georgian Revival scaled-down museum that kept the scale of Pendleton House and the proportions of Benefit Street. And here are some views of the gallery as Earl Rowe conceived it when the museum opened in 1926. And I'm going to read you some descriptions to give you the idea of display as they thought of it. Rowe would say, institutions and collections with masterpieces are places of pilgrimage to lovers of the beautiful, and the emphasis on high quality rather than quantity is what we need most. The function of the Modern Art Museum is that of inspiration to artist and public. Success is achieved in this direction when the silent message of the work of art is such that a fund of inspiration is inexhaustible. He says the installation of objects are in keeping with museum practice today. One line hanging with plenty of space between is seen in the case of graphic and pictorial arts. Combinations of furniture, paintings, and kindred arts are frequent. The walls have individual treatments to give proper setting for the objects displayed. Lightness and simplicity are features of the exhibitions. The results are that the visitor wanders through all the charming galleries, enjoying the effect and beauty and unconscious of all that has been to produce the effect to prove ideal conditions under which works of art may be shown. So it's this notion. How are we on time? All right, I'll wrap it up. So what Dorner brought instead was he was really much more interested in recontextualizing works of art, getting away from art as this timeless piece, but these are all artifacts of a certain culture and of a certain time that related to an era that you could not remove it out of time, but he saw art history as this progression of eras and movements leading to the present, and that's what he wanted to convey to the viewer. So this is the Babylonian Installation. This is actually a transparency painted that would go over a window looking out into the Radicke Garden. And so his idea was to install works of art. Dorner believed that to show architectural ruins was a romantic notion, and he did not believe in the romance of the ruin, but he wanted to convey in these drawings the actual architecture of the time and how these objects might relate to the architecture. Here's an installation of a mummy casing in the museum, and he would use dramatic lighting to instigate the notion of what a tomb might be. Dorner was not against the notion of reproductions or actual heavy-handed conservation. Again, here's the ruin. Here's the restoration, which some people found ghastly that he did, but he figured, what does this convey? He thought he would restore the object to what it was meant to be, and that any knowing, seeing person could distinguish between where the restoration took place. Here's how he decided to display the classical collection. Each gallery would have a different look in view. The classical collection, this is the Mediterranean blue sea and sky. This is a sarcophagus that he elevated on a pedestal to simulate the effect of the hill of the Acropolis. Same sarcophagus in Earl Rose configuration. Transparency of a Roman market. This is Rowe's conception of the Gothic gallery. Here's Dorner's early Christian art, actually installing arches and doorways, dark spaces, to give the impression and effect of a medieval church. Dorner went as far as to contact a professor from Columbia University to figure out what historic music from different eras would have sounded like, and he installed headphones in the gallery for people to actually listen to the music. So overall, Dorner was very much into a experiential space of the museum, rather than being awed and awestruck, expecting to have an emotional experience in front of a work of art. He really wanted to activate the space and see to it that one experienced through art in combination with writing, music, didactic displays, that one could experience an art of its time. So I'll wrap it up there. Thank you.